maybe to set the stage a little bit, I will always talk a little bit about bits that we discuss in the book, and then I will ask you a question. And basically what we will be discussing in the next 30 minutes is how can technologies help humans cooperate better? How can technologies help humans defend themselves better? And how can they do both in light of AI? And this will be relatively crypto focused, not in the sense of cryptocurrencies, but in the sense of cryptography and cryptographic technologies. And so in a nutshell, I think one thing that we have discussed throughout today was, could you close the door? Thanks, guys. One thing we discussed throughout today was a lot of DeSci, DSOC. And so I think we've really managed to already convey a lot of the kind of systems that we want to change, right? It started with DeFi, now we have DeSci, that's great. But I want to ask you to lift your gaze a little bit more and think about, okay, what is the next thing? I think, Wes has already discussed a little bit about what that could actually mean. And I want to ask you to perhaps consider that a little bit as a broader framework of what would it look like if our entire civilization was running on these technologies? And that's what we wrote a book about. But really, all I want from you guys is your ideas on this topic. Okay, so basically, in a nutshell, the book was wonderful. So it's, I think, well, we wrote this book. Okay, so sorry, let me start again. Now that we're all here and paying attention, I think one thing that has become really obvious throughout Foresight's history is that the cryptography track is almost the layer that powers, or that could potentially power many of the other layers in which we're building technologies. And so we have always had a really big overlap with the cypherpunks back in the days, but it was always one of our focus areas. But now it has become this kind of substrate on which all of these other tools can exist on. And we are currently seeing that with DeSci, but I think over the long time, you can really see it in the way that we cooperate with humans and in the way that we also cooperate eventually with other artificial intelligences. And so we basically sat down, we're like, okay, what would this look like to take this premise seriously? What would it look like to really rebuild civilization from scratch on these technologies that are giving us better systems? And first, we talk about human cooperation. Then we talk about human defense, because I think many of the technologies that we're building in DeSci, let's say, frankly, they don't have a good defense system. And if we don't come up with one ourselves, we will have a centralized defense system. And then lastly, we take it out one notch and say, well, it's not only human actors we want to cooperate with, but also ultimately artificial intelligences. What would that look like in a decentralized way? And to give you a bit of an understanding, one of my co-authors, Mark Miller, basically the book was written in many interviews on many Sundays. And he, to give you a bit of an understanding of his idea of why he wanted to work on this book, he basically said, Mark Miller, co-author, has a personal history in the battles over cryptography. In 1976, Mark apprenticed himself to Ted Nelson, creator of the Xanadu hypertext system. Who knows Xanadu? Okay, they shared a vision of global hypertext publishing system as a censorship-free liberating force, but they knew that without the right architecture, any such system would be corrupted into a tool of 1984 style oppression. Before the invention of modern cryptography, they could not solve this puzzle. Mark was an avid reader of Scientific American and always went straight to the Gartner's column. After reading about the RSA discovery, he called Ted at an ungodly hour and joyously proclaimed, Ted, we can prevent the Ministry of Truth. They immediately set out to get a copy of the RSA publication. In those days, you could not simply download scientific publications. Instead, they mailed a request for a copy and waited. Nothing arrived. The US intelligence community had suppressed publication to preserve their ability to spy on all conversations. Mark decided to take action. His mission began with a trip to the MIT campus. As a 20-year-old computer geek, he was welcome in the tribe, and before long, he had a paper in hand. He knew that it was critical to distribute it far and wide and to counter the attempted suppression. Fully aware of the risk, he gave copies to his most trusted friend, telling them, if I disappear, make sure this gets out. Handling the paper only with gloves, he started going to several different copy shops and making copies. He mailed copies anonymously to technology-minded hobbyist groups and magazines. In 1978, the US intelligence dropped the attempt to suppress the RSA paper. Mark will never know if his personal actions made any difference, but this experience made the stakes clear. Technologies of freedom are worth fighting for and building. And so that's to set the stage a little bit of why people were interested in this for a really long time. And I think now, he was interested in this and working on this actively in 1976. Now we have the tools to really build these systems. And I think that is something that he himself couldn't be more joyous about. And I think that is something on all of us to build. But to give you perhaps a brief overview of basically what the book is about. And I always deep dive into one chapter, and then I want to hear from you. So at the beginning, we kind of discuss the evolution of cooperation, and we go from this principle of voluntary action as being really important for civilization and of violence having decreased over time. We review a few of the mechanisms at hand here that were like really important for that. For example, the ability to actually uphold voluntary interactions and them becoming a shelling point. So over time, violence decreased, and over time, we are able to engage in more voluntary actions over time. We discuss a few strategies for the game ahead. For example, multipolarity is often probably a good one, and how we can compensate for power dynamics. Then we discuss how cooperation actually evolved. Like, how did contracts, institutions, and rights, like, how did they make it into the wonderful civilizational superintelligence that we have today? And again, here we look at the mechanism at work, and we discuss a few technologies for doing so in the future. And the final thing is, we really don't want to just do that with humans, but also with other AIs. So that is kind of like where we are today. Now I want to go to you guys, because now let's start with how can technologies help humans cooperate better? Okay, so we've heard a lot about the sessions today. I want to pinpoint a few out that I think may have not gotten enough airtime yet. I think prediction markets, even though you mentioned them also in your talk, are actually really wonderful. This is one that was created at a Foresight member gathering in 2000, and it was created by Robin Hanson, and people actually like literally back then sent checks to our offices to vote. So we were an illegal gambling house at one point, apparently. But I think this notion of prediction markets and using that for replication markets, using that for finding out, like the real experts, as you also earmark them over time, is a really wonderful tool that I think is still not being looked at enough. I think a second one, we all, I think, are somewhat on board, at least with the immutability of money, or like at least with better systems. So for doing so, I think one that's interesting is new ways of creating property rights, right? Like, we all know that the current ways don't account for externalities. What would it look like to do so differently? And we go through a few examples here, and also through the problem of what about space property rights, right? There we have a new pie that isn't being distributed yet. What would it look like to actually create a better property rights regime for space? Then the one that I think is really interesting for this session is contracts. And so basically the ability of us to create more and more complex contracts. And a few that we name here is like, the ability of just using templates for doing much of the contracting that otherwise is super difficult and dangerous and like very expensive to do would be a major game changer. Then I think an ability that we're not really focusing on enough are like split contracts. So, really this kind of like notion that what would it mean if we have half human in the loop and half an automated system? Many of the things that we currently are doing shouldn't be entirely automated. We definitely want some kind of humans in there to review parts of it eventually. And you can have like systems like Claros to do decentralized arbitration. There's other really wonderful contract experiments. There's the video contract from Nick Szabo from like a long, long time ago. Like, what does it mean to preserve the meeting of the mind? Like, usually like prose is great because it allows us to get something concrete on paper, but it like loses a lot of the richness. And so what would it look like to create video contracts and have them enmeshed in the smart contract so that later arbitrators know a little bit like what to do? And then we have a bunch of like different experiments on DAOs, collective action problems like assurance contract, quadratic funding, retroactive funding. And lastly, we go to what would it mean to do this all privately with a cryptography toolkit. And so here we discuss a few of the tools, and I really welcome you to check them out. But I think the whole stack of cooperation that we currently are doing can be redone in a privacy preserving way. And there's lots of different projects out here. Why am I saying this all to you? Because I want you guys to give me in the next 3 minutes a few examples of cooperation technologies that you're really excited about for humans that are not in this yet. What do you think is like the next really like dynamic by which humans can learn to cooperate better that may be beyond DeSci that we may have not touched upon yet? Like, basically, if we were standing here in 5 years, what could we be talking about for humans to cooperate?
Yeah, so I want to highlight this tool that Audrey Tang, who's the digital minister of Taiwan, uses for the whole country, which is called Polis. Right?
Yeah, she gave a talk and that to this group that wrote the book.
Okay, so it's in your deck. It's in your yes. So, okay, never mind.
No, but go for it.
Oh, okay, so it can be like dramatically improved, and I'm actually like trying to find technologies that can improve it. But what it does is it just it allows groups, like massive groups of people, to comment on whether they agree or disagree with seed statements, and then add on their own. And over time, you get like clusterings of different groups, and you can see where are the kind of cleavages in opinion and where there's consensus, and allows you to actually like help you find consensus as well. And if you were to add on other things like, say, batch proposals with quadratic voting, or even like social contacts with non-transferable tokens, then you can really even start to get a richer perspective of where there is consensus across different groups. And this is really useful when you, especially when like governments are trying to figure out how to regulate technology. In the case of Taiwan, they're trying to figure out how to regulate Uber, and they use this tool to find consensus and like actually kind of make all sides happy and prevent what typically happens in politics mediated by YouTube and big media and big tech, which is it just sort of conflict enhancing, right? So I would just recommend Polis as something to investigate and use.
Yeah, Polis is a wonderful tool, and it's actively being used.
Sort of like a mimetic evolution of information.
It just like clusters opinions and lets clusters like evolve based off of like news statements which people respond to, like agree or disagree.
Does Decentralized offer that process?
I don't know what that process
Do you
is.
know of anything which more so does the less of just agree or disagree, but someone adds their own version, so like mimetic evolution?
Yeah, so that's so that people can respond to statements and modify, say, oh, what about this statement? Then you can agree. And what I'm saying is like you could improve the mechanism by adding intensity of preference, and that's like the quadratic voting part. And then you could actually increase, even add in more richness by introducing social context.
I think a really interesting idea, just thinking of us as all super intelligence, each one of us has a neuron in that. There exists some universal information which is highly beneficial to all of us that would be highly mimetic and spread. I sort of think about this as like the search for the holy grail of vibes to a degree. And
Also, otherwise, local information.
I think there's like some talk on that, like a new global philosophy or some sort of unifying thing that would spread mimetically to the people. I think it's kind of the opposite of an info hazard, which represents like, what is the worst information in the world to spread? I don't think there's really a term yet for what is the most powerful positive information in the world to spread.
We take one more?
Two. One is so one thing I've been confused about is like why hasn't liquid democracy like taken off as much as like one would have expected? Like it came up I think around the same time as like prediction markets and stuff like that. But for some reason I'm like interested in that question. But I'm like I'm not sure why. The second is I think like so I think Wikipedia was an interesting like coordination too. This is an idea that like like one could call like something like Scissor Wiki, like which is my naming, but the original idea is something that I first heard from Eric Drexler. Is something like having a wiki for like the most controversial point of view, like for every like controversy, like for every debate or every argument, like having a wiki kind of a thing that actually presents the strongest case on either side.
Well, that's what they did hypertext for back in the day, you know? Like Eric was working on it, Mark, the co-author, they're working on that together, and like it's just really difficult to implement. I think in the interest of time, I just want to kind of like prime you on a few bits and pieces, because afterwards we're going to have a book club here as well, in case people really want to dig into this. But so now we know a little bit, okay, like what the hell, how can humans cooperate better potentially, and like a few of your ideas also on making that work. The next chapter, we're basically doing a speed run of like, okay, we're clearly not there yet. We're clearly all using the systems that we're currently using. So how do we get there? And we have this idea of a genetic takeover by which the new system grows within the old one and gradually outcompetes it over time, borrowed from biology. And then there's a bunch of ways in which obviously we have to mature, like there's assassination markers problem potentially with immutability. We have the DAO bug, which also Wes spoke about, and the bugs that can really like evolve in this. We have like we need the decentralization mandate. We need proof of location. We need to actually make sure these systems are decentralized. Can learn from history, like IBM, internet giants, and centralized blockchains. Those are all kind of like gradual centralization problems. And so we discussed a little bit like, how would it look like to get these systems right? Now we're going to the more juicy bits. Let's talk about the defense. So I already said like, in the DeSci talks, if we're not building defense systems in, we're going to have a really, really big problem. on the one hand, we have this problem of like a smaller number of actors will be able to destroy the entire world, especially with the more decentralized systems that we're building. And so we go through a few risks here. But on the other hand, the second trap, which is I think we're also going to likely fall in, is civilization suicide by a single point of failure. Usually when you talk about the fact that risks are arising, people usually go to the government as the main actor that can help you prevent the risks. But we discussed that the government itself also has lots of different centralization problems that may actually create a worse solution than the problem that they're trying to solve. And we discussed these risks of like global authoritarianism and so forth being on the rise. And so I want to know from you, what would it mean to do a third path? We have to prevent the risks in a decentralized way. Do you know of any good projects out there that are actually trying to do decentralized security? Let's, for example, say we have biorisks. Like one potential that we discuss here is the concept of a multipolar active shield, also originally from Drexler. And it would basically mean that you have a privacy preserving monitoring system that monitors the biolabs that are actually creating really weaponizable technology. And you could maybe have also a decentralized enforcement mechanism strapped towards it. Obviously, there's lots of problems on oracles and so forth, but the first people are actually building these selective transparency systems where you can basically have an encrypted monitoring layer that only gets triggered if certain like tripwires get triggered. So basically only when certain, molecules are actually let's say really engineered, then only the defense layer gets triggered and you find out which lab actually did that. And so like these systems are really, really difficult to build, but if we don't build them, many people in the future can with CRISPR-Cas or so forth, really create risks that could destroy everyone. And if we don't protect for the risk, we'll have like governmental agencies cracking down on them and basically taking the technology away. It could lead to an arms race, whatever. So I think if we don't face this really hard problem of building decentralized monitoring systems that monitor for the risks, then we will face really bad futures, basically. Do you know of any other one where you're like, this is a great way in which like decentralized systems have actually taken on the defense of civilization? Satellites for greenhouse gas monitoring. Okay, say a few words more.
So one of the big questions in greenhouse gas is, which is where CO2 or CH4? Well, CH4 is leaking out of natural gas and oil infrastructure. And they always said it was this very low leakage rate. What if I have a belt of satellites that are detecting these things? We have that now. Oh, they were all live. Oh, they went out, they did the maintenance. Oh, now they've decreased the methane emissions, right? But in fact, in other cases, the methane emissions, which is a much worse greenhouse gas, makes natural gas worse than CO2. So there's this major question: do we go from oil to natural gas? Is that an intermediary? Do we go to hydrogen, which we made from natural gas? Is this a mistake? So the satellites were a decentralized way of doing this, and you have private satellite companies and government, and both of them. The government ones have public data. There's a woman from Arizona State University here, right? They might be running some of these kinds of satellites for GPL or something. And now you have the data. So the data answers the question and you can't cheat. Because if you admit it, we can see it.
Wonderful. Anyone else wants to throw one out there? Yes, decentralized defense layer for civilization.
Decentralized defense layer for mis and disinformation. There are projects out there like the Disarm Network that will go find people who are creating disinformation and they can kind of interrupt them on the spot, but that's not going to deal with all the dis and misinformation, some of which is actually incentivized by like our attention economy. So at Open Labs, we built this tool called Public Editor that will allow an entire language community or news community to defend their own public discourse. We take the 100 articles that are going most viral each day, and through an assembly line annotation process that people on the internet contribute to, we're labeling specific words and phrases in the articles with specific types of misinformation, identifying over 40 different types of argumentative fallacies and cognitive biases and inferential mistakes. We end up putting a score in the articles that can then be used to eventually people will be able to kind of filter out misinformation from the news feeds. But all of this is like against the centralized tech companies who will not cooperate with us. And yet we're doing it anyway, and probably going to do it all transparently.
Wonderful. We had another one here. Okay, I'm monitoring time because we're now going to move on to AI, which is like the big one in the room. But yes, if you want to say another one.
Well, humans are obviously the biggest risk in terms of moral hazard. So why don't you have a group or a team of people with high trust, but someone is lying to themselves, maybe, or unconsciously or consciously to other people. There's this technique called group inquiry, made by some ashram in Australia. But I've seen it and I've heard that it can really filter out any bad actors or help people gain consciousness about their stories that are not true, that they keep on repeating to themselves, because you can actually switch roles and you can go, yeah, it's really cool.
Of course, we have a local group, like a social technology in there as well. Yeah. But in a nutshell, I think a few, that we press out here is encrypted surveillance, and then something like drones with body cams. Like if we're going to have decentralized enforcement, you need to make sure that the enforcers are being monitored. And like one early prototype could be something like drones with body cams where the footage gets released 10 years later, to make sure that they're not just randomly going around killing civilians as they currently do. Anyway, there's a few that we propose, but I think that is like the second higher hanging fruit of like, how the hell are we going to do this? And then let's switch to the third one. We have a really long chapter on computer security because I think it's massively undervalued and it's Mark's specialty. If you want to know more about that, I really, really welcome you to dive into that. It's terrifying what cyberwar can already do. And it's amazing the systems that we already have if we only use them. There's a ton of really good stuff out there. Okay, let's get to the fun one here. Let's get to AI. So basically, one thing that we're recapitulating here is this kind of thread of like, on the one hand, like runaway AI is really, really dangerous. And on the other hand, most of the ways that systems are also being built right now are also really centralizing. So you have these like, really kind of like almost like a repetition of the current political problem, also in AI. I think like many of the actors are not accountable. They are centralized. And then if you worry about super intelligence, which many of us do, then really having a single actor that can be omnipotent, omniscient. How the hell are you going to make sure that that's aligned with human values, especially if that singleton shares none of our substrate, shares none of our evolutionary context? It's a really, really fucking hard problem. And so I think one way in which one could do that is by saying, well, what would it look like to look at civilization as the main super intelligence? So we are all collaborating. We can solve many more problems than one individual can. And so instead of trying to replace civilization with this artificial entity, what would it look like if we created entities that were more specialized and focused and enshrined them into this economy that is more and more getting virtual, and that is more and more allows us through cryptography to have systems in which we can cooperate with AIs, right? Many of us do that already, like, I think on a daily basis, really. It doesn't really quite matter so much whether those systems are humans or AIs if you have good computer security in place and a few other bits. But basically our whole premise is like, let's kind of like switch the framework here and let's talk a little bit about how it could look like if we really push more for decentralized approaches in AI. And I know that TJ and again, Eric Drexler have done really incredible work on that. So like they are definitely someone to talk to in a way that like we kind of like borrow a bit like also from Drexler's writing on that, which are really, really wonderful to read. But in a nutshell, I think just to give you two examples of like, how could that look like actually? Like one of them, I think, is, using a little bit like the local knowledge that we have, especially there are a few edge cases actually where centralized systems may not be as good as decentralized ones. And that is where you need local knowledge from people, right? So you can really incentivize really well through DAOs and so forth, the local knowledge creation, and that can then be used to actually answer very specific queries, especially in ways where you're not really allowed to use the data, like especially for like these high privacy preserving use cases like financial data, healthcare data. Here, actually, like these cryptographic systems that function not quite yet to homomorphic encryption, but like eventually maybe, or even federated learning, differential privacy. All of these have a goal to play here because they give us an edge over centralized systems, and especially with AI. Like I think like really privacy preserving machine learning, which I think also Jonathan, I know if he's here, is working on, is really like a wonderful, wonderful tool that is underexplored. And we basically review a few of them, and I really welcome you to take a look if you're interested, but I want to know from you, do you know of any wonderful integration between the cryptography space and AI that you think could like drastically re-level the playing field and make these technologies more decentralized and more human accountable that we may not be aware of? It's a new space, yes.
I don't know if people are following like Nevermind, what they're doing with compute.
We are using Nevermind for the AI generative art tool with the exomes features.
Yeah, then people can own their own data, and at the same time, other people can benefit from training on their data as well.
Yes, absolutely. You will all be using Nevermind tomorrow. So
and also Oasis Lab that also did something with data governance and compute to data. And of course, we have Wes, you chatting already about compute over data. That is how we can bring your computation to distributed data storage.
Yeah, I think Bacalao is building an incredible infrastructure here. Yes.
There's a company in Taiwan called PTQ that's developing an open source package called Keylong, which enables uses zero-knowledge to enable quite computation on encrypted data that's quantum consistent. And so they're developing new hashing algorithms. So kind of going to be on Poseidon, which is specifically part right now, thinking about how mathematically we can push the envelope and secure encryption for decades.
Wow, neat, cool. Yes.
So when you think about sort of note taking and voice right now, like state representation is very so I run a thing called AVA, we start for you and we start thinking like thinking and cryptography. So you can basically own the things you say. And it's basically like, you know, a few people might just use feature recognition systems in the future. So it knows easily. And at any point you can say, well, everything I say, I want to be able to like contribute and sort of like the owner of this as well. And this is like some of the things I'm really thinking about.
Wonderful, man. You have really good answers to this. Like usually the room goes silent when it comes to cryptography and AI. Yes. Oh, wait, sorry. Could we go to someone because he hasn't said anything yet? Sorry, say again, please. One. Okay. Wonderful. Okay, we have a few here. I'm aware that we have 3 minutes left. So I just want to maybe finish with like a call for collaboration. This book has been written in an incredibly weird way. Basically what we did is if you go on the Foresight X Gaming the Future book, you will see that it has been written with many of you also in the room. Everyone who attended the seminars for 1 year helped us write this book all together. Our idea was really to showcase the technologies that you guys are working on and put them in the larger civilizational framework, and to actually encourage people in crypto to like live up to the like expectation. Like I think literally these technologies have the potential to change the way that civilization is running, that is accounting for risks, and that is emerging with AIs. And if there's nothing more important than that, then I don't know what. The book is here physically, and I'm going to do a book club on this in a second, but it's also a Substack. And so in all of these, as a Substack book, you basically find the seminars with the keynote speakers that we had in each of these areas. So we had Balaji talk about the network state, and we had many folks that joined us. We have here like, we have price discovery markets and civilization of progress. Vernon Smith, he got a Nobel in economics, and Andrew spoke a lot about civilization of progress. So we wrote this all together with many of the people that you know, and like likely also many of you. And we really want to welcome you to like continue collaborating, because this is an kind of like open source document to some extent. Like this Substack book at least can live further and can really like, you know, grow and trying to collect and compare a little bit the technologies that many of you guys are working on. And so we have here space technology rights, we have Kate Sills, then we have Arthur Brightman from Tesla. And so in a nutshell, I really want to invite you to check out also the videos, because they are really crucial on like getting a bit more kind of like up to date on like what individual people in the space are working on. But in a nutshell, it was written and collaborated with a lot of people also in this room. So thanks a lot for that. And like, I really just want to kind of like maybe close with a note for like the urgency around this. We had a workshop earlier this year to really try to get a few technologies on the table that have been developed since the book, and trying to see what we can do to help them along. Like ultimately writing a book is a nice intellectual effort, but like it is really there to like showcase also to people in crypto the immense potential that you guys have for like really changing, I think, the way that civilization is running. So we have the same workshop again next year to really deep dive into these technologies. The workshops are already out. The 2023 workshop is already out here on events. If you want to join that, please apply. If you want to get the book, it's available for pre-order. I'll be doing a book club on this now. But I think just like getting out there in the different communities that you're in and telling them about the dangers of impending AI and telling them about the opportunities, telling them about the fact that we have existential risks to face as a civilization, and telling them that if they don't build technologies to account for that, we will have other solutions that we may not want. I think like really just kind of like getting the word out a bit and making kind of like the people that you're building with realize the pretty, I think, large role they could play in a decentralized way in civilization would be wonderful. I'll leave it at this. There's many reports out of the workshop that we did. And if people want to join for the book discussion, it will be here in this room at the same time with the Tech Tree Social. So if you want to learn more, the books are out here and I'd be happy to welcome you. So thanks a lot.